Welcome and thanks for joining me for this very unusual presentation. My name is Arne and I'm from the University of Mainz in Germany. And today I want to talk about our project on modeling the Altiplano-Puna Magmatic system. So the first question you may have is, why do we do that? How can numerical models help us? And they allow us to do experiments that we couldn't do in the lab. So we couldn't build a lab scale model of a magmatic system that has the correct pressures, temperatures, and timescales. But in a computer we can. And in a computer it's also much easier to just change one parameter and see how the system reacts. And in our project we also want to treat the geometry of the magma body as a variable and see how the system reacts if we change the shape of the magma body. And the other question you may have is, what do we need for numerical models? And the answer is very simple. We need a lot of data. We need all we can get from seismology, from gravity, geochemistry, all the things that are listed here provide important constraints for us to set up a good model. And a good model should really be consistent with as much data as possible. The area we are interested in is the Puna Plateau in the Andes. The reason for that is there's a lot of data on that region. So for example, there is a seismic imaging study that sees this very large magma body, which is about 200 kilometers in diameter, which is also indicated by this outline here on the map. And at the central volcano here at Uturuncu, we have INSA data that observe this concentric uplift pattern. So if you're not familiar with INSA data, you can essentially read this color bar as vertical velocity. And what we can see is that we have this inner region where we have uplift, and then we have this diffuse ring of subsidence around it. And this signal has been observed for over 20 years now, and there's another study that tracks the point of maximum uplift, so here the center, tracks it over time, and we can see that the velocities are slightly decreasing over time, and we also want to try to answer the question why that is. The first and maybe most important question to set up such a model is how do we constrain the magma body? How do we know what's its size, shape, and position? And we can look at seismic imaging studies, like I mentioned before. This is an S-wave model, and from that we could extract this magma body, and we could take that and move on. Or we could actually also look at gravity data. So what I show here is the Boogie anomaly for the region. Boogie anomaly shows you or tells you about density anomalies below the surface. And you can see there's really something going on in the center. So if we take a closer look at the gravity data, we can also see that here in the north and in the south, we also have a lot of signal of more than minus 300 milligal. And that is because in the Andes, we have a thickened crustal root, as you can see here. So the crust is much thicker to create enough buoyancy to actually carry the mountain chains. So if we ever want to fit this signal, we also have to include this thickened crust. And we did that using a software called GeoMio, which was developed in our group. And this allows you to create 3D bodies from drawing 2D slices and combining them into a 3D body, and also allows you to compute gravity signals. So we came up with this shape, and this body can create this gravity signal, and you can see also in this profile here that we can now fit the overall trend. And this region here that we don't fit yet, this should be the region that should be due to the magma body. Next up, we have to add the magma body. So we started from the geometry that we can see in seismic imaging, and then we changed that until we came up with this blue body here. And the combined signal of this blue body and the thickened crust that I showed on the slide earlier gives us this combined signal here. And this now looks quite similar to what we see in the data. And we can also see in this profile here that we now also fit the lower part of this profile. But we can take another step actually, because gravity signals or boogie anomalies are non-unique. So there's a trade-off between the density contrast between magma body and crust, and also the volume of the body. So what we did is actually run 60,000 different models where we allowed this magma body to change its shape and its size. And we also allowed the density contrast to vary. And if you plot all of that out, you get something like that. So relative volume is a quantity that combines all the geometric parameters that we used in the study, which were 5 in total. And they all combine in one here. And on the other axis, we have density contrast. And the color bar shows the misfit of every model to the real data. We can see that all the well-fitting models, they cluster in this area. The bulk of them, there are a few out here, but most of them are in this area. So we can conclude that our density contrast between magma body and crust should be on the order of 80 to 130 kilograms per cube. So knowing that, we can take another step and think about melt fractions, because we can get estimates on melt density by looking at eruption products. There are petrological studies that looked at them and analyzed them. And so we can do mass balance, and then we can draw up this diagram where we have the water content of the melt, which is important. We have the density contrast between magma body and crust, and the density of the crust itself. And these planes here show the melt fraction that we would have in the magma body, because when I talk about a magma body, I'm not talking about a pocket of pure melt, but an area that is partially molten and partially crystallized. So if you plug in what we have, and that is, for example, that is what I showed earlier, the density contrast between crust and magma body, and some values from the literature about the crustal densities. And then we are left with the question about water content. And there's one study that predicts this water content to be very high, between 8 and 10% weight percent. We combine all of that, we get this red ellipsoid, which shows the values that we think are reasonable. And you can see it's mostly between 10 and 20%, and some area also going above 20%. So we can say the melt content in the Altiplano-Puna magma body should be on the order of 14 to 22%. And now we can take all of this information that we have from gravity and put it into our forward model. So this is how our setup looks like. We have a layered crust, we have a thickened crustal root, we have lithospheric mantle on the bottom, and we have our magma body, which we split into two parts, an upper dacitic part and a lower andesitic part. Just some notes on the code we use. We use LAMEM. It's also developed in our group, which is a Stokes code. And so that means it's driven by density contrast. There's no additional pressure source that we prescribe. Everything is calculated from density contrast. It also follows the conservation laws of physics. Our rocks are compressible, and very importantly, our rheology is temperature and strain rate dependent viscoelastoplastic. So we have all the deformation mechanisms that we can observe in real rocks. We can also observe in our model, and we use 128 cells per dimension. And if we run our model forward and compare it to the data, so again, here is the INSAR data, the satellite data, and here's one of the results of an early run using the same color bar, and these circles are there for orientation. We can see it doesn't really fit. We have some region that is uplifting, and we have some areas that are subsiding here, but it's all in the wrong place and it doesn't have the correct shape. So I took another look at the magma body. This is an east-west slice through it. It's actually vertically exaggerated, so in reality it's much flatter. And my idea was maybe it actually looks like that. So the gravity data would not allow us to distinguish between this red curve with this more pronounced central rise and the blue curve. And if you run a model with that, so with this red body here, we get a much better fit to the data. So now we have the central part, which is uplifting, and we have this ring of subsidence around it, just like it is in the data that we can observe. And if we take a look at the magma body itself, you can see here we have this central rise that I spoke about. And if we now look at the velocities inside the magma body and around it, we can see that material is flowing from the outskirts of the magma body towards the center and upwards from here. And we can also plot the crustal velocities on top of that. And we can nicely see we have this area that is uplifting in the center, and then we have this ring around it that is subsiding, just like we can see it at the surface. So I decided to play around with this central rise a bit more. In this case, I just made it 50% narrower, so I reduced the diameter by 50%. And we can see the same pattern, but it's much, much weaker. So you can see the length of these arrows is the magnitude of velocity. And you can see there's just much less flow. We get a little bit of subsidency and a little bit of uplift in the center, but in general the signal is just much weaker, and you can see the same at the surface. So the pattern is still kind of there, but velocities are very low in the center. You can hardly see any subsidence. So we can see that the flow inside this magma body is crucial to produce this surface uplift pattern. And we can play around with these parameters a bit more. So again, here we have the inside data. Here we have the reference run that fits nicely. And again, I played with the diameter of the central rise a bit. I made it 25% wider. And we can see we got more flow in the magma body and also higher velocities at the surface. And if I make it narrower, I get lower velocities, also less subsidence around it. A similar thing happens when I change the temperature of the crust. So here the upper crust is hotter, and with that it's also weaker. And again, it allows for more flow in the magma body and higher velocity at the surface. And if I make it colder, again we get a stronger crust, we get less flow, and we get lower velocities. So there's one more case. Here I changed the viscosity of the magma body or the magma mush. And if I lower the viscosity, then once again I get higher velocities at the surface and more flow inside the magma body. And if I get a higher viscosity, I get lower velocities at the surface. So I hope you remember that at the beginning I said that this uplift pattern has actually slowed down for the last couple of years. So all of these cases here would be candidates to be causing that. But I guess with how fast that changed, this one is probably the most likely. So viscosity is something that can change over orders of magnitude within a short time period, and so this would be the most likely. So for these last two cases, I actually changed the bottom part of the magma body, so the main part of the magma body. Here I made it 25% wider. Here I made it 25% smaller. And you can see they have very similar patterns and also similar to the reference run. So in theory, they should also work, but they don't fit the gravity anymore. So if we just looked at uplift velocities, we couldn't really distinguish between these two cases and in this case. But if we also look at gravity data, we can really rule out these cases. So if we summarize all of that, we have a geometry, a magma body geometry that is consistent with both seismic imaging and gravity data. From our gravity modeling, we can conclude that the density contrast between magma body and crust should be 80 to 130 kilograms per cubic meter. And coupled with that, the melt content in the magma body should be on the order of 14 to 22%. From the dynamic modeling and the INSAR data, we can also conclude that the magma buoyancy can actually explain this surface uplift pattern that we see. We do not need any additional pressure source. We don't need an expanding magma chamber. All we do need is the magma transport from the outskirts towards the central rise. If we don't have this central rise, we don't get the flow pattern. We don't really get this uplift pattern. And other factors that impact the system are the viscosity of the crust, the viscosity of the magma body, and again the geometry of the magma body. And lastly, we can see that by combining different data sets, we get more and more constraints on the system. We get a better idea of the system. So as I showed here, these cases would have worked if we just looked at uplift data, but they don't work for gravity data. And here, this blue body would have worked for gravity data, but it wouldn't have created the correct uplift pattern. So that's it from my side. I hope this served as a nice introduction for you of what we can do with numerical models in magmatic systems. So I want to thank you for joining me for this talk, and if you have any questions, please feel free to email me.